The night my husband passed away, before the grief had even had a chance to settle in, my daughter-in-law pointed a finger right in my face and called me an old leech, to the silent agreement of my stepchildren. They threw me out of the very house they thought belonged to their father, completely unaware that the $50 million fortune they were all fighting over was actually, entirely, under my maiden name. My name is Rosemary Thompson. I'm 72 years old, from right here in Boston, and this is the story of how I stayed silent for 35 years, just waiting for the day to take it all back. Stick with me through this story. I hope it touches your heart, and please, follow along so you don't miss what happens next. And I'd dearly love to hear your own stories, so please, leave a comment and we can share with one another. The fire in the Italian marble fireplace crackled, its sparks dancing like tiny spirits, trying to push back the cold that had settled over the Beacon Hill mansion. Outside, the snow had begun to fall. The first snowflakes of the season, thick and heavy, clung to the window panes, painting a silent, white winter scene. The quiet outside was a strange contrast to the chaos that had just subsided within. The last of the guests had left, taking with them their empty condolences and rushed hugs. They left me alone in that enormous house, alone with the pain of losing Samuel, and alone with the smell of wilting lilies, a scent so sweet but heartbreakingly funereal. My Samuel was gone. After 35 years together, the man who had been my son, the very center of my world, had been extinguished. I sat in his favorite teal velvet armchair, my hand unconsciously stroking the worn fabric. The warmth from the fire couldn't reach my heart. A block of ice had formed there the moment the doctor shook his head, and it seemed to grow larger by the minute, not from the grief of loss, but from what I knew was sure to come next. For 35 years I had been Rosemary Thompson, but before that, I was Rosemary Sterling, a young architect with dreams of her own and a not insignificant fortune left to me by my parents. When I met Samuel, he was a struggling talent, an artist with vision but lacking a head for business. I fell in love with him, with the way he spoke about the curve of an archway or the play of light in space. For that love, I stepped into the background, becoming the wife, the support system. My fortune, my strategic mind, became the invisible foundation for the Thompson and Associates empire that all of Boston admired. Samuel was the face, the celebrated genius, and me? I was the woman behind him, a muse, a devoted wife, a perfect role, a play I had willingly performed for more than 3 decades. The sound of Brenda's heels on the oak floor was sharp and decisive, cutting through my thoughts. She walked into the living room, followed by Kevin, Scott, and Linda Samuel's children from his first marriage. They didn't look like children who had just lost their father. There were no tears, no visible pain. They looked like a tribunal, an army ready for the final battle. Brenda, Kevin's wife, was always the ringleader. She wore a tight, designer black dress, her blonde hair in a perfect updo, her crimson lips like a gash on her pale face. Her eyes scanned the paintings on the wall, not with artistic appreciation, but with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. She stopped in front of me, crossed her arms, and her look was colder than the blizzard outside. "Listen, Rosemary." Her voice was sharp as a razor without a trace of sympathy. "It's over. Samuel's gone. Your meal ticket is gone too." I said nothing, just looked her straight in the eye. I saw undisguised greed, a contempt that had been simmering for years. She had never seen me as a stepmother or even a family member. In her eyes, I was just a temporary arrangement, an obstacle between her and the vast Thompson fortune. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're just an old leech who has clung to this family for far too long. We've put up with it long enough. Dad was always too soft on you." An old leech. The words echoed in the quiet room, toxic and cruel. I glanced at Samuel's children. Kevin, the eldest at 45, the one whose homework I'd helped with, the one I'd stayed up all night with when he had the measles, was now staring at the floor, hands in his pockets, the very picture of cowardice. Scott, the second son, looked at me defiantly, giving a slight nod in confirmation of Brenda's words. He always believed his father owed him, that the world owed him. And Linda, the youngest daughter whose hair I had taught to braid, was staring blankly out the window, as if this whole conversation had nothing to do with her, as if kicking a 72-year-old woman out of her home on the night of her husband's funeral was just a minor chore. Their silent consent hurt more than Brenda's insult ever could. Brenda jutted her chin toward the front door, where the funeral wreath still hung. "Get your things. Tonight, this house, the company, everything needs to be sorted out by the rightful heirs. We need the space." I had been preparing for this moment for 12 years. Ever since the day Samuel, after a minor heart attack, had confessed to me about his gambling debts and disastrous business decisions, we had begun to make a plan to protect the real legacy, not just the money, but the truth, and a plan to protect me. He had cried that night, saying, "Rose, I'm so sorry. I haven't just failed as a businessman. I failed as a father. They'll tear you apart when I'm gone." And I had promised him I would be all right. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of burning wood and fading lilies. Then I looked straight at Brenda and the children of the man I had loved. "All right then," I said. My voice was surprisingly calm, even to my own ears. My composure seemed to throw them off. They'd probably expected tears, begging, or at least an argument. But no, the play was over, and I had no reason to act anymore. I stood up, the armchair letting out a soft creak. I walked past them, looking at no one, and went up the stairs. Each oak step groaned under my feet like a farewell. 35 years. I had walked up and down this staircase more times than I could count. The first time as a bride, countless times with children running behind me, and now, for the last time. Our bedroom was just as we'd left it. The large bed was unmade. On the nightstand, the glass of water Samuel had been drinking from was still there. I didn't let myself look at it for too long. The grief was still there, smoldering like a hot coal, but this was no time for weakness. I opened the closet. On one side hung Samuel's suits, still carrying his familiar scent of cologne. On the other, my clothes. Sparkling evening gowns, custom-made outfits Samuel loved for me to wear. I ran my hand past them all. They were just costumes for a role. I pulled a small suitcase from under the bed, an old one I'd brought with me when I first came to this house. I only packed the bare essentials, a few simple outfits, my toiletries, an old worn notebook filled with my architectural sketches from before I was married. I paused at the jewelry box. Inside were the gifts Samuel had given me over the years, the diamond necklace for our 20th anniversary, the pearl earrings for my 60th birthday. I gently closed the lid and left it on the dresser. Those belong to Rosemary Thompson. Tonight I am becoming Rosemary Sterling again. I picked up the single photo frame from the table. It was a black and white picture of Samuel and me on our wedding day. We were so young, our eyes full of hope. I didn't take it with me. That memory, I would keep it right here, in my heart. When I came back downstairs with the small suitcase, the four of them were still in the living room. They were whispering among themselves, probably already dividing up the house, dividing up my life. They fell silent when they saw me. I walked straight to the door without a word. My hand rested on the cold brass doorknob. Before opening it, I turned to look at them one last time. Brenda had a smirk on her face, the smile of a victor. Kevin still had his head down. Scott and Linda just stared at me with empty eyes. "The keys," Brenda said, holding out her hand. I didn't answer. I opened my purse and took out the house keys, but instead of handing them to her, I placed them on the small mahogany table by the door, a final, quiet act of defiance. This was not a surrender, it was a declaration. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The snowstorm had gotten stronger. The bitter wind whipped at my face, carrying a flurry of white flakes. The streetlights cast a hazy, weak glow through the thick snow. I pulled my coat collar up, feeling the cold seep deep into my bones, but that chill was nothing compared to the ice in the hearts of the people I'd left behind. I didn't look back. I walked into the snow, my small suitcase rolling behind me, leaving a single, long track on the pure white ground. Every step was a release. I was walking away from an old life, an old role, to find the one that truly belonged to me. The yellow cab glided through Boston's white night. Outside, the city I had called home for 35 years passed by like a silent film, blurred behind the snow-covered glass. The familiar red brick buildings of Beacon Hill, the pale yellow streetlights casting shadows on the sidewalks, it all looked foreign now, as if it belonged to another life, to another woman. I didn't look back at the mansion one last time. There was nothing to miss in a place where love was valued in dollars and respect was measured in inheritance. I sat quietly in the back, my small suitcase beside me, my hands clasped in my lap. The driver glanced at me occasionally in the rearview mirror, a flicker of curiosity for an old woman traveling alone in the middle of a blizzard. He probably thought I'd had a fight with my family or was heading to some lonely train station. I let him think what he wanted. Invisibility was my best cloak right now. "The Cambridge Inn, please," I had told him, my voice perfectly steady. Not the Four Seasons or the Ritz-Carlton where Brenda's crowd frequented. Just a classic, unassuming inn in Cambridge, on the other side of the Charles River, a place far enough away to escape the Thompson world and just close enough for me to watch and control my chessboard. The cab pulled up to a 3-story brick building, tucked away on a quiet street. A simple wooden sign read, "The Cambridge Inn." Warm light spilled from the windows, a promise of sanctuary. I paid the driver with cash I had prepared, adding a generous tip. "Thank you. Have a safe night." He nodded, perhaps a little surprised by my composure, and then the car merged into the snow and disappeared. I stood alone on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the freezing winter air. It stung my lungs, but it also cleared my head in a way nothing else could. I pulled my suitcase, walked through the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside. The inn's interior was cozy and old-fashioned. The air smelled of aged oak and polish. A slightly worn Persian rug covered the floor, and leather armchairs stood like silent witnesses in the corners. Behind the small reception desk, a young man with tousled hair and thick-rimmed glasses was reading a book. He looked up when I entered, a little surprised. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I'd like a single room." "For how long?" "A week," I replied, "for now." He typed on his computer. "We have one room left." "Name, please?" This was the moment. The moment I officially shed the skin I'd worn for 35 years. I felt a sense of release as the words left my lips, clear and firm. "Sterling," I said. "Rosemary Sterling." The name felt both strange and familiar, like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. The clerk didn't react. He simply typed the name into the system. To him, I was just another anonymous guest. But to me, it was an oath. Rosemary Thompson, the wife, the muse, had been left behind the doors of that mansion. Standing here now was Rosemary Sterling, the architect, the investor, the woman who stood on her own 2 feet. "Will that be cash or card, Miss Sterling?" "Cash," I said, placing crisp $100 bills on the counter. "Cash leaves no trail. Cash is freedom." He took it, counted it, and handed me a brass room key with a professional smile. "Room 2B, 2nd floor, ma'am. I hope you have a pleasant stay." I thanked him and carried my own suitcase to the stairs. The runner on the steps was worn in the middle, and my feet sank into the silence with each step. The 2nd floor hallway was dimly lit by yellow lamps. Room 2B was at the very end. I fit the key in the lock, a dry click echoed, and I stepped into my sanctuary. The room wasn't large, but it was clean and tidy. A single bed with a thick wool blanket, a small wooden writing desk, a wardrobe, and an armchair by the window. It was all simple, without a hint of luxury. It was the complete opposite of the opulent rooms in Beacon Hill, filled with antiques and works of art. But here, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't a stage. There was no audience. This was a front line, a command center, and I was the only general. I set my suitcase down, not bothering to unpack. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. From here, I could see the snow-covered rooftops of Cambridge. In the distance, the spires of Harvard University rose faintly in the night. A world of knowledge, of truth, of intellect, a world so different from the shallow bubble of Brenda and Samuel's children. I felt like I had come back to the right place. After a moment, I turned back, took off my coat, and hung it up neatly. I plugged in the small electric kettle provided in the room and took a chamomile tea bag from my purse. An old habit. In the middle of life's storms, a hot cup of tea could always bring a moment of calm. When the water boiled, I poured it into a mug, watching the steam rise in delicate swirls. The gentle scent of chamomile filled the room, chasing away some of the chill in my heart. I sat down in that armchair, cradling the warm mug in my hands, letting the heat seep into my fingers. I didn't think about Brenda or her cruel words. This wasn't the time for anger. Anger, it just clouds your judgment, and right then, I needed a clear head more than ever. I thought about Samuel. I thought about my promise to him. And I thought about the 12 years I'd spent preparing for this exact moment. Those discreet meetings with Mr. Adler at little out-of-the-way coffee shops, the afternoons I spent poring over property and trust law, the thick binders of documents that I read and reread until I knew every clause by heart, the establishment of limited liability companies under the Sterling name, the quiet legal transfer of assets piece by piece until the Thompson & Associates empire was, for all intents and purposes, already in my hands. Samuel knew everything. He signed every single paper with a mixture of sadness and relief in his eyes. He knew it was the only way. When the tea was gone, I set the mug down on the table. Enough stillness. It was time for action. I pulled my smartphone from my purse. It wasn't just a phone. It was my weapon, my command center. I scrolled through the contacts to a single name, saved under the codename A. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone only rang once. Adler. The old lawyer's voice came through on the other end, deep and steady, like an anchor in a storm. No pleasantries. He'd been waiting for this call. Adler, I said, my own voice just as calm and clear. Samuel is gone. There was a brief pause, a moment of respectful silence for the man we had both lost, our mutual friend. Then, I continued, "It's time. Let's begin." "I'm ready, Miss Sterling," he replied, and his use of my maiden name was a confirmation that we had entered a new phase together. "Everything is prepared, just as we discussed. The temporary freeze on all joint accounts and company credit lines will be activated at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The legal notices are already drafted." "Good," I said. "I'm at the Cambridge Inn under the name Sterling. All communication will go through this number from now on, only for matters of the utmost importance." "Understood. Is there anything you need?" "I need you to pass along a message," I said, looking out at the snow falling thicker and faster outside the window. "When they contact you tomorrow, and they will, once they find everything locked down, tell them that according to the preliminary will, Mrs. Thompson will be provided for, and that they have nothing to worry about." Mr. Adler was silent for a second, likely processing my strategy. A false sense of security, to lower their guard. Very clever, ma'am. The more confident they are, the more they will show their true colors, I explained. I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves. "I will do exactly that," he said. "Rosemary, are you all right?" For the first time, his voice held a note of personal concern. I looked around the small room, my safe harbor. The pain of losing Samuel was still there, a deep wound that would never fully heal. But alongside that pain, another feeling was rising. A sense of freedom, of clear and certain purpose. "I'm more than all right, Adler," I said honestly. "We're going to do exactly what he wanted. We're going to protect his true legacy." "Yes, ma'am. We will." We ended the call. I placed the phone on the table. The plan was in motion. The gears of justice, however slow, had begun to turn. Tonight, back at the mansion on Beacon Hill, Brenda and Samuel's children were probably celebrating their victory. They were sitting on a throne they didn't know was already hollow. They thought they had gotten rid of the old leech. Dawn comes late in Boston on a snowy December day. The first weak rays of sun filtered through the thick clouds, casting a tired gray light over the city. I woke up while it was still dark. I had slept, a short but deep and dreamless sleep, the sleep of a soldier before a battle. The quiet of the Cambridge Inn was a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was just beginning to brew on the other side of the Charles River. After a hot shower, I dressed in simple clothes, a pair of thick wool trousers, and a cream-colored turtleneck sweater, and sat at the small writing desk by the window. My breakfast was just a cup of tea and a croissant I'd bought the night before. I had no appetite, but I knew I needed the energy. This was going to be a war of attrition, and I couldn't afford to falter. I opened my small, compact laptop, a device I had always kept for my personal use, never connected to the home network. It was protected by layers of security and held my entire, true financial empire. While Brenda and the children were scrambling over what they thought were Samuel's assets, I had already started my workday. I scanned the stock market reports, checked the performance of investment funds I had been secretly managing for 20 years. I sent a few emails to my asset managers in New York and Zurich, giving them brief, precise instructions. I reviewed the preliminary designs for a commercial redevelopment project in the Seaport District, one of the properties I had bought years ago before the area boomed. Everything was under control. The world of Rosemary Sterling was running smoothly, efficiently, and completely invisible to the Thompson family. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, my private phone buzzed. A text message from Mr. Adler, just 3 words. The system is locked. I allowed myself a small smile. The curtain had just gone up on the first act. At that same moment, in the offices of Thompson and Associates, Brenda strode into the magnificent architectural firm like a conquering queen. She wore a crimson power suit, her stiletto heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. Kevin trailed behind her, trying to look confident, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. Scott and Linda were already there, perched on the expensive leather sofas in the reception area as if waiting for a coronation. "Good morning, Mary," Brenda said to the older receptionist, who had worked for Samuel for 20 years. Her tone was a mixture of sweetness and command. "I need you to call a meeting of all key personnel in 15 minutes, in the main conference room." Mary, a loyal and perceptive woman, looked at Brenda with surprise. "Mrs. Thompson, what is this regarding?" "The transition," Brenda snapped, offering no further explanation as she marched toward Samuel's office, the office she now considered her own. Kevin followed her in, closing the heavy oak door. "Brenda, don't you think we should take this a little slower? People are still in shock about Dad." "Slower?" Brenda whirled around, her eyes narrowing. "Are you an idiot, Kevin? This is the most critical time. We have to assert our authority, get a firm grip on everything before anyone gets any funny ideas. You think those vice presidents aren't already eyeing this chair?" She sat down in Samuel's large leather chair, spun once, and placed her hands flat on the polished mahogany desk. "As of today, this is ours." 15 minutes later, about 10 senior staff members were seated around the long conference table. The air was tense with uncertainty. Brenda stood at the head of the table, with Kevin at her side. "Thank you all for coming," Brenda began, her voice full of false solemnity. "As you know, our family has just suffered a great loss. Samuel Thompson wasn't just a father and a husband, he was the soul of this company. However, his legacy must continue. As his heirs, Kevin and I will be temporarily taking over executive control, with the support of Scott and Linda." An awkward silence filled the room. The chief financial officer, a man named Paul, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, we are all very sorry for your loss, but from a legal standpoint, a transition of leadership requires official documentation from the lawyers and approval from the board." Brenda let out a condescending smirk. "Of course, Paul, that's just a formality. Mr. Adler will be sending the papers over shortly. Now, I want to see the latest quarterly financial report, as well as the status of the firm's investment portfolios." Paul nodded, opening his tablet. "Yes, ma'am, I'll email them to you right." He tapped a few times, then frowned. "That's odd. I can't seem to access the main server. I'm getting an authentication error." The head of human resources spoke up. "My account too. I was trying to access the payroll system and it's blocked." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Kevin, sensing the situation was spiraling, quickly said, "It's probably just a network glitch. We'll look into it. This meeting is adjourned." Once the employees had filed out, leaving the 4 Thompsons alone, Brenda slammed her hand on the table. "A network glitch? What the hell is going on?" Scott, ever the impatient one, pulled out his phone. "I'll call it. Old man Samuel probably set up some ridiculous password we don't know about." But the IT department was also helpless. They reported that the entire server system appeared to be frozen by a top-level administrative command. All normal access rights had been revoked. They needed a 2-factor authentication code that was being sent to a phone number and an email address they had never seen before. Real panic began to set in. Brenda roared at Kevin, "Call Adler now. Ask him what is going on." Kevin's hands trembled as he dialed. After a few rings, Mr. Adler's voice came through, terrifyingly calm. "Adler. Finch Law Offices." Adler speaking. "Mr. Adler, it's Kevin Thompson," Kevin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're at the office and we're having a little trouble with the computer system. Everything seems to be locked." "Ah, yes," Mr. Thompson, Mr. Adler replied, his tone betraying no surprise whatsoever. That would be a standard security measure automatically triggered upon the passing of a key board member. It's to protect the company's assets from any unauthorized access until the will is officially executed. Unauthorized access? Brenda snatched the phone from Kevin. What are you talking about? We are the heirs. We need to run the company. Madam, Mr. Adler said, his voice still perfectly even. Until the will is read, no one has the right to declare themselves a legal heir. All company operations are temporarily suspended. This was Mr. Thompson's wish, to ensure a transparent transition. What about the bills? Payroll? Brenda shouted, her confidence melting away like snow in the Sunday. Don't you worry, madam. A special contingency fund has been set up for these essential expenses. Mrs. Thompson will be well taken care of, and you all need not concern yourselves. Everything is under control. That line from Mr. Adler, Mrs. Thompson will be well taken care of, was the sugar-coated dagger I had prepared. It made Brenda and the others both furious at being shut out and smugly satisfied, believing that the Mrs. Thompson in question was me, an old woman who would get a generous stipend and stay out of the business. They couldn't possibly imagine that the Mrs. Thompson with the real control was the very one they had just kicked out of the house. Brenda slammed the phone down on the desk. That old fool. He's playing games with us. I'm sure that Witch Rosemary said something to him. Linda, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, her voice laced with panic. So, what about Dad's credit cards? I just tried to go shopping and my card was declined. Scott swore under his breath. My joint account with Dad is frozen too. And now they understood. They weren't just locked out of the company. They were completely cut off from the financial lifeline they had taken for granted for so many years. They were like pet goldfish who were used to being fed, suddenly scooped out of their luxurious bowl and dropped into a dry, harsh reality. They were in a maze of paperwork and legal regulations they couldn't begin to understand. They were holding a treasure map, but they couldn't read it. And worse, they were beginning to realize that the only person who could guide them out of this maze was the very one they had treated with such cruelty. In my small room in Cambridge, I took another sip of tea. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Paul, the CFO, sent to my secret email address. Miss Sterling, as agreed, the system has been switched to secure mode. The freeze was successful. The Thompson family is in a state of considerable confusion, awaiting your further instructions. I typed a short reply. Let them be confused. Maintain the status quo. Thank you, Paul. A week passed since the night I left the Beacon Hill house. For me, it was 7 days of quiet, productive work. I restructured my entire investment portfolio, approved architectural plans remotely, and even took time for long walks along the Charles River, breathing in the air of freedom. I felt like a chess player who had made her strategic moves and was now simply observing her opponent floundering on the board. But for the Thompson family, it was 7 days of living hell. Their initial confusion quickly curdled into helpless rage. With each passing day, they discovered another door slammed shut in their faces. Brenda, in a desperate attempt to maintain her powerful facade, tried to use Samuel's name to negotiate with business partners, but no one would deal with someone who had no legal standing. She called members of her high society club, hinting at a few minor complications and the need for a temporary loan, but rumors of the chaos at Thompson & Associates had already started to spread. The social smiles and promises were now replaced with evasive answers and unanswered calls. The glittering, superficial world she had worked so hard to build was collapsing like a sandcastle. Scott tried to visit the company's construction sites, acting like the new boss, but the project managers, following instructions from Paul, politely refused all his requests. He was used to growling and giving orders, but now, his voice carried no weight. He was just an outsider, standing on the sidelines of his own father's empire. And Linda, the youngest, faced an even more devastating crisis. She had to pay for her own coffee. Her supplementary credit cards were blocked. The high-end boutiques on Newbury Street she frequented now looked at her with wary eyes. For the first time in her life, she had to look at a price tag before buying something, and it was a humiliation she could barely endure. Kevin had it the worst. He was stuck in the middle, caught between Brenda's escalating fury on one side and the terrifying silence from Mr. Adler and the complete corporate gridlock on the other. He called the law office dozens of times, but the answer was always the same, like a broken record. Everything will be resolved once the will is officially read. Please be patient. Their patience ran out on the 8th day. I was sitting in my room at the Cambridge Inn, reviewing documents Mr. Adler had sent through a secure channel, when my phone rang. It was him. "Miss Sterling," he said, and I could hear a hint of quiet satisfaction in his voice. "They've taken the bait." "Oh?" I asked, taking a sip of tea. "Do tell." "Mr. Kevin Thompson just called me. On behalf of the entire family, he is formally requesting a reading of the will as soon as possible. He said, and I quote, "This delay is causing serious harm to the company's operations and to my father's legacy." I smiled. My father's legacy. What a nice turn of phrase. I told him I would be more than happy to accommodate their request. Mr. Adler continued, "I have proposed a meeting for next Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at my office. All beneficiaries named in the will are required to attend." "Including me," I stated, though I already knew the answer. "Of course, it's a legal requirement." He seemed to hesitate when I mentioned your name, but desperation won out over arrogance. He agreed. "Excellent, Adler. Send the formal summons. Make it look official, imposing. Let them feel that this is the moment they've been waiting for." "I'll see to it at once, ma'am. I will see you on Monday." Back at the Beacon Hill mansion, Kevin hung up the phone and turned to face Brenda, Scott, and Linda, who were sitting in the living room. The room, usually so pristine and elegant, now looked disheveled and grim. Papers and unpaid bills were scattered on the coffee table. The air was heavy like lead. "Well?" Brenda asked impatiently. "Monday, 2 o'clock, at Old Man Adler's office," Kevin announced, trying to force some confidence into his voice. He agreed. This is finally going to be over. A flicker of hope appeared in their eyes. The wait was almost over. They had endured a week of humiliation, but their reward was at hand. "She has to be there too," Kevin added a bit hesitantly. Brenda scoffed. "Fine. Let her be there. Let her watch, with her own 2 eyes, as we take over everything. Let her hear just how small of a retirement fund Samuel left for her. It will be the final humiliation for that old leech." She stood up and began to pace, her energy seemingly restored. "All right, we need to prepare. Kevin, you'll wear your best suit. Scott, Linda, you too. We need to look like the owners we are. We have to project class, project power. Adler and that woman need to know we are not to be trifled with." Their blind confidence had returned. They started making plans. Brenda was already dreaming of selling the company and moving to Los Angeles. Scott was making a list of the sports cars he was going to buy. Linda was browsing 5-star resorts in the Maldives. They were dividing up a pie that they didn't know no longer belonged to them. They were like actors rehearsing their lines for a play, completely unaware that the director had rewritten the entire script. Later that week, the formal summons arrived by courier. They were printed on heavy, high-quality paper, sealed with the law firm's wax insignia. They looked like an invitation to a coronation. Kevin held his, feeling a wave of relief. Finally, something tangible, something official. He was so tired of the uncertainty. Brenda placed hers on the coffee table like a trophy. "See," she said to the room, "this is our validation. This Monday, everything goes back to the way it's supposed to be." In my room at the Cambridge Inn, I received an identical letter, delivered by Mr. Adler himself. I read it, then placed it on my writing desk. For me, it was not an invitation. It was a summons to battle. I spent the weekend preparing. Not my clothes or my appearance. I prepared my spirit. I reread Samuel's last letter to me one final time, letting his words fortify my heart. I reviewed every legal document, letting the truth become my armor. I felt no hatred. Hate is an exhausting emotion. Instead, I felt a cold resolve. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this to execute justice. I was doing this to protect Samuel's legacy from his own flesh and blood, and I was doing this for myself, for the woman who had been silent for far too long. On Sunday evening, I looked out my window. The snowstorm had passed. The sky was clear and filled with stars. The city of Boston glittered below, beautiful and serene. But I knew, It was just the calm before the storm. Monday arrived with the sharp, clean cold of a New England day after a snowstorm. The sky was a brilliant, almost cruel blue, and the sun glinted off the snow-lined streets, creating a beautiful, unforgiving scene. It was the perfect day for a reckoning. I didn't choose a power suit. Real power doesn't need to shout. I wore a simple navy blue wool dress, a color Samuel always said brought out my eyes. I wore the pearl necklace my mother had left me. My silver hair was tied back in a neat bun. I looked like any other 72-year-old widow, elegant, a little sad, and utterly harmless. That was exactly the image I wanted them to see one last time. I arrived at the law offices of Adler and Finch 15 minutes early. The building was in the financial district, an imposing tower of glass and steel. Mr. Adler's office was on the top floor, with a panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. A secretary showed me to a private waiting room. Mr. Adler had a cup of chamomile tea waiting for me. "Are you ready, Rosemary?" he asked, a touch of concern in his voice. I looked out the window at the ships moving slowly across the glittering water. "I've been ready for 12 years, Adler." At precisely 2 o'clock, the Thompson family arrived. I could hear them coming down the hall, the click of Brenda's heels, the loud chatter of Scott. They swept into the conference room as if they were walking a red carpet. Brenda was wearing a stark white suit, a bold and calculated choice, as if she were an angel of justice. Kevin, Scott, and Linda were also dressed in their most expensive clothes. They were the perfect picture of wealth and entitlement. When they saw me sitting there, alone on one side of the long mahogany table, their confidence seemed to swell. Brenda's eyes swept over me with barely concealed pity. She probably thought I was there to beg for a scrap from the inheritance. They sat down on the opposite side, forming a solid wall. Brenda took the center seat, like a queen, with Kevin beside her. Mr. Adler entered, followed by 2 junior lawyers who would serve as witnesses. He placed a thick leather briefcase on the table with a heavy thud that silenced all conversation. "Good afternoon," Mr. Adler said formally. "We are gathered here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Samuel Thompson. All named beneficiaries are present. We may begin." He put on his reading glasses, opened the briefcase, and took out a document bound with a wax seal. The air in the room grew thick. You could have cut it with a knife. I could feel their anticipation. Their hearts must have been pounding in their chests. "Before I read the specific bequests, Mr. Adler began, I must first clarify the total net value of Mr. Samuel Thompson's personal estate at the time of his death, after all debts and funeral expenses have been accounted for." He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air with deliberate weight. Brenda leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming. "The total value of his personal assets is appraised at exactly $453,211.67. The number just floated there in the silent room. Brenda frowned. She glanced at Kevin, a look of confusion on her face. 450,000? That was a ridiculous figure. It wasn't even enough to buy a small condo in Back Bay. "There must be some mistake," Scott blurted out, his voice thick with disbelief. "My father, the company, the total assets should be in the tens of millions." Mr. Adler looked at Scott over the rim of his glasses. "Mr. Thompson, I repeat, this is Mr. Samuel's personal estate. We will get to the company later. Please do not interrupt." The authority in Mr. Adler's tone silenced Scott, whose face flushed with anger. Brenda whispered to Kevin, "She must have hidden the rest. This is just the tip of the iceberg." Kevin nodded, trying to reassure himself. Mr. Adler continued, his voice as steady as a judge's sentence. "I, Samuel Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He went through the standard legal openings, the small bequests to Samuel's old university, to the city library. Every word he read only heightened the impatience of the Thompson family. Finally, he reached the part they had been waiting for. "To my beloved children," he read, "to my eldest son, Kevin Thompson, I leave the sum of $80,000. Kevin blinked. 80,000? He had been expecting at least a few million. "To my second son, Scott Thompson, I leave the sum of $80,000. Scott's jaw dropped, his face a mask of incredulity. "And to my youngest daughter, Linda Thompson, I also leave the sum of $80,000. Linda looked as if she was about to cry. That amount wouldn't even cover the shopping trip to Paris she had been planning. Mr. Adler went on, giving them no time to process. This money, totaling $240,000, is my final gift to you, as a start to the independent lives I hope you will build for yourselves. A stunned, angry silence fell over the room. Brenda was the first to break it. She let out a dry, scornful laugh. "What a joke," she said, shaking her head. "A start? Samuel must have lost his mind. So what about the rest of it? The millions? The company? The house?" Her eyes shot toward me full of venom. "Ah, I see. It must all be for the beloved wife. A generous allowance to let her live out her days in comfort. Isn't that right, Mr. Adler?" She said the word comfort with a sneering emphasis, as if it were a dirty word. I remained silent, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I was letting her arrogance reach its peak. Mr. Adler didn't answer Brenda. He simply continued reading the final part of the will, his voice unchanged. "And all the rest, residue and remainder of my personal estate, including the remaining sum of $213,211.67, along with all my personal effects, my watch collection, and my library, I leave to my partner, my confidant, my beloved wife, Rosemary Sterling Thompson." Mr. Adler folded the document. "That concludes the last will and testament of Mr. Samuel Thompson." The reality hit the room like a sledgehammer. In total, the personal fortune of Samuel Thompson, a celebrated architect, was less than $500,000, and the largest share his children would receive was a mere $80,000 each. Brenda shot to her feet, her hands planted on the table as she leaned forward. Her beautiful face was now twisted with rage. "No, this can't be. You're lying. You and she are in this together," she shrieked, pointing her finger at me. "She manipulated him. She took all his money. You old leech. What did you do with the $50 million? Her question hung in the air, the question she thought was her most damning accusation. But it was the very question I had been waiting a week to answer. Mr. Adler took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, and this time his voice had a sharp, cold edge. "That is an excellent question, and I think it's time we talked about that $50 million. But first, you should sit down. For this next part of today's proceedings, you're going to want to be sitting." Brenda's confident expression vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Kevin, Scott, and Linda stared at Mr. Loss, Adler, and then at me, as if for the first time they were realizing that something was wrong, that there was a part of the story they had never been told. The silence in the conference room was no longer one of anticipation, but of utter bewilderment. The four Thompsons sat frozen, questions and doubts swirling in their minds. Mr. Adler's words, "This next part of today's proceedings," hung in the air, a sign of something even worse to come. Brenda, though seated, was coiled as tight as a spring. She still believed this was some kind of conspiracy, a trick she was about to expose. Her eyes darted toward me, a mixture of hatred and morbid curiosity. Mr. Adler did not rush. He opened his leather briefcase again, but this time he didn't pull out an old, sealed document. Instead, he withdrew a series of modern, blue-backed binders. He placed them on the table, a tall, substantial stack of files. As Mrs. Thompson just asked, Mr. Adler began, his voice no longer that of a will reader, but of a sharp litigator presenting his case. "The question is, where is the $50 million estate, including the company, the house, and the other investments?" He paused, looking directly at Brenda. "And the answer, madam, is quite simple. It is exactly where it has always been. The question is not, where is it, but rather, whose is it?" He pushed the first file across the table toward them. It slid over the polished mahogany and stopped right in front of Kevin. "This," Mr. Adler said, "is the certificate of title for the house at 18 Lewisburg Square, Beacon Hill, Boston." Kevin hesitated, then slowly opened the binder. His eyes scanned the legal text, then stopped on a name. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty white. He looked up at me, his expression one of pure disbelief. This can't be," he stammered, unable to form a full sentence. Brenda, losing patience, snatched the file from her husband's hands. She read it quickly, and then she too was stunned into silence. Rosemary Sterling Thompson. She read the name aloud, her voice a whisper, as if it were a curse. Sole proprietor. Transferred on June 15, 2013. Correct, Mr. Adler confirmed. 12 years ago, the $10 million house you are living in has been the sole and legal property of this Rosemary for over a decade. That's impossible, Scott yelled. My father bought that house before he ever met her. It's the Thompson family home. That is true. Mr. Adler nodded calmly. Mr. Samuel bought it, and then, in 2012, he nearly lost it to business debts. It was Rosemary who used her own personal funds, a significant amount, to pay off the entire mortgage and save the house from foreclosure. To secure her investment, and by mutual agreement with Mr. Thompson, the title was transferred entirely to her name. Mr. Samuel retained only lifetime residency rights, a clause which expired upon his passing. The first truth bomb had landed. The house they saw as their family's crown jewel, the very house they had just thrown me out of, was, in fact, mine. The humiliation of their actions suddenly multiplied tenfold. Before they could recover, Mr. Adler pushed a second file forward. Next, let's discuss the firm, Thompson and Associates. This time, a trembling Linda opened it. Inside were articles of incorporation, company bylaws, and a list of shareholders. As you can see, Mr. Adler explained, Thompson and Associates is not a sole proprietorship. It is a limited liability company. Mr. Samuel Thompson owned 15% of the shares. 15%? Brenda practically shrieked. He was the founder. His name is on the door. Indeed, Mr. Adler said. But the entity that holds the other 85% of the shares, the majority shareholder, with final say in all matters, is a parent company by the name of Sterling Holdings, LLC. He paused, letting the name Sterling sink in. And the sole owner of Sterling Holdings, LLC, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, is Mrs. Rosemary Sterling Thompson. If the shock about the house was a slap, this was a knockout punch. The entire empire they thought they were inheriting was actually in the hands of the woman they had just called an old leech. The irony was so bitter it was almost comical. No, that's not possible, Kevin mumbled, shaking his head. Dad never said. You never worked a day in your life. Finally, I spoke. I had been silent the entire meeting, letting the papers and the numbers speak for me. But now, it was time for them to hear the truth from my own lips. That's where you're mistaken, Kevin, I said, my voice not trembling, but calm and strong. I didn't work in the way you understand it. I didn't go to the office every day. But I worked. I worked when I researched the real estate market late at night. I worked when I analyzed the financial reports your father brought home. I worked when I made the investment decisions that saved this company from bankruptcy not once but 3 times. I looked at each of them in turn. The parent company, Sterling Holdings, was founded with my family inheritance long before I met your father. When he ran into trouble, it was Sterling Holdings that provided the capital. And to protect that investment, 85% of the shares were transferred. It was a perfectly legal and fair business transaction. Your father was the face of the company. I was the foundation. Mr. Adler pushed the final, thickest binder to the center of the table. And this is the portfolio of other assets owned by Sterling Holdings, LLC. It includes 2 office buildings in the Seaport District, a portfolio of rental apartments in Back Bay, and various stock and bond portfolios. The total value of these assets, he glanced at a summary sheet, is estimated at approximately $5 million. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. So, allow me to summarize for you. The $10 million house belongs to Rosemary. 85% of the $35 million company belongs to Rosemary, and the other $5 million in assets also belong to Rosemary. In total, the $50 million estate you've been asking about is the legal, private property of Mrs. Rosemary Sterling Thompson. He paused, then added with a touch of irony, the remainder of Mr. Thompson's estate was, in fact, his minority share of 15%, worth about $5.25 million, plus his personal assets. But due to his personal debts and charitable pledges, The amount left to be divided among his beneficiaries was the figure I announced at the beginning. A dead silence descended on the room. The truth was laid bare, irrefutable, backed by seals and signatures. Their fantasy had been shattered to pieces. They weren't heirs to a fortune. They were the recipients of a small gift from their father's meager remaining assets. Brenda looked at me, her eyes no longer filled with contempt, but with pure, raw fear. She had built her entire life, her entire sense of self-worth, on the Thompson name and its accompanying wealth, and now it was all gone. She had insulted and evicted not some dependent old woman, but the most powerful person she had ever met. Scott was hyperventilating, his face red with a mixture of rage and shame. Linda had begun to sob openly, her tears smudging her expensive makeup. And Kevin? He just sat there, staring into space, as if his soul had left his body. He was probably remembering the times I helped him with his homework, the times I consoled him after a breakup. He was remembering the stepmother he had stood by and watched his wife verbally abuse, and he was realizing, in that horrifying moment, that he had betrayed the one person who truly held his future in her hands. The silence in the conference room was now as heavy as the air before a thunderstorm. It was no longer the silence of shock, but of paralysis. The four Thompsons sat there, each lost in the wreckage of the world they had once known. The blue binders on the table were like tombstones, marking the end of their illusions. Brenda, who had always been the fire, now seemed to have been extinguished. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes fixed on the mahogany tabletop, as if it might swallow her whole. Her arrogance was gone, leaving only a terrifying emptiness. She had bet everything on a hand, not knowing her opponent held all the aces. Kevin was still staring at me. In his eyes, I didn't see anger, but a profound confusion, a turmoil of conflicting emotions. He was trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, gentle stepmother from his memories with the powerful woman sitting across from him. The two images couldn't coexist, and the conflict was tearing him apart. Scott was trembling with rage. He clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles white. His anger wasn't just directed at me, but at his late father. He felt deceived, betrayed by the very man he believed owed him the world. Linda was still crying, but her tears were no longer the petulant sobs of a child who had lost a toy. They were the gasps of someone realizing the utter meaninglessness of her life. The designer handbags, the luxury vacations, it had all been built on a foundation of lies. Mr. Adler let the silence stretch on for another moment, allowing the full weight of the truth to sink into their very cells. Then he cleared his throat, a small sound, but enough to pull everyone back from their private hells. "Now," he said, his voice calm, "I believe we have clarified the matter of asset ownership. However, there is one final piece of business." He reached into his leather briefcase and took out a yellowed envelope, carefully sealed with red wax. He placed it on the table. "This is a personal letter. Mr. Thompson wrote it many years ago, and he instructed me to read it only at this precise moment, after all the financial truths had been revealed. He wanted his final words to be heard in the context of the truth." Everyone's attention immediately snapped to the envelope. A letter from the dead, a message from beyond the grave. Mr. Adler carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out several sheets of handwritten paper. Samuel's handwriting, a bit shaky but still strong, was unmistakable. Mr. Adler began to read, his voice dropping into a somber, respectful tone. "My dearest children Kevin, Scott, and Linda." It was as if Samuel's voice was echoing in the room, a familiar sound that now carried an entirely different meaning. "If you are hearing these words, it means that my greatest fear in my final years has come to pass. The fear that my love for you was not enough to teach you about life's true values. The fear that the wealth I provided was not a gift, but a curse." Mr. Adler looked up, his gaze passing over each of his friend's children. They were listening, their defenses seemingly gone, replaced by a raw curiosity and a flicker of pain. He continued to read, "I want you to know the truth. Not the truth in numbers or legal documents, but the truth from my heart. The company you thought was mine was, in fact, built on the brilliant mind of Rosemary. The house you grew up in was secured with the inheritance from her family. I was merely the face, the flamboyant artist. She was the true architect not just of buildings, but of our entire life. Years ago, when I nearly lost everything due to my own pride and bad decisions, It was Rosemary who stepped in. She could have left me, taken her assets, and built a new life, but she didn't. She stayed. She used her fortune and her intellect to save not only the company, but to save my honor. The transfer of assets to her name was not a scheme. It was an act of returning what was rightfully hers. It was the only right thing I could do. It was the only way I could ensure that the woman who sacrificed her own career for me would be safe. Safe from the world, and safe from the very children I loved, but failed to raise properly. At this, Mr. Adler's voice caught slightly. He paused, then read the final part of the letter. "I have failed you as a father. I gave you everything that money could buy, but I forgot to teach you about the things it cannot: hard work, gratitude, and integrity. I saw the greed grow in your eyes over the years. I saw your respect for Rosemary, the stepmother who loved you as her own, be replaced by contempt and calculation, and it broke my heart. I am not leaving you a great fortune because I refuse to continue feeding your weakness. The small amount I have left you, consider it a chance to start over, a chance to build something on your own, however small, that is truly yours, a chance to become the people I always hoped you would be. And to Rosemary, my partner in all things, thank you for everything. Thank you for being the foundation of my life. Thank you for loving my children even when they were undeserving. Live your life now, Rose. Be free. You have earned it. With love, no matter what. Your father, Samuel." When Mr. Adler finished reading, the room was utterly silent. Linda's sobs had ceased. Scott's anger had subsided. There was only the weight of those final words, the confession, the hope, and the heartbreak of a father. That letter accomplished what the legal binders could not. It stripped away the last layer of denial, revealing not just the financial truth, but the truth of the love, the failure, and the secret sorrows of a family. It showed them a different Samuel. Not the powerful architectural tycoon, but a flawed man, full of weakness and mistakes, and a boundless, helpless love for his children. And it showed them a different Rosemary, not an old leech, but a benefactor, a protector, a woman who had silently sacrificed to keep their family from falling apart. Brenda buried her face in her hands. For the first time, I saw her truly broken, not by the loss of money, but perhaps by the realization of her own smallness and cruelty. Kevin was crying. Real tears. The tears of a late and profound regret. He looked at me, his mouth moving as if to say something, but no words could escape. I sat there, calm in the eye of this emotional hurricane. I felt no triumph, only a deep and abiding sadness. A sadness for Samuel, who had to die with such a heavy heart. A sadness for his children, who had to learn a lesson at such a terrible price. And a sadness for myself, for all the lost years. Mr. Adler carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. "This meeting is now concluded," he said softly. The silence after Samuel's letter was read did not last. It was like the brief, eerie quiet in the eye of a hurricane, just before the winds return with a more destructive force. The truth, though undeniably revealed, was too bitter to be swallowed at once, and the first reaction of those used to living in a fantasy is not repentance, but denial and rage. Scott was the first to explode. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward. His face was crimson, veins pulsing at his temples. "No, I don't believe it. This is a trick," he roared, pointing first at Mr. Adler, then at me. "It's all a conspiracy. A letter? Who knows if that's even real? She probably wrote it herself. She planned this whole thing." Desperation had turned to paranoia. He couldn't accept the image of a failed father, a father who had depended on his second wife. He would rather believe in an elaborate conspiracy than face the fact that the foundation of his life was a lie. Brenda, after her moment of collapse, lifted her head. The emptiness in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, hateful fire. She had found an enemy to blame, a target for all her failure and humiliation. "He's right," she hissed. "You manipulated him. For years. You played the part of the dutiful wife while you secretly siphoned everything away. You old leech. I was right all along. You were just smarter than I gave you credit for." She stood up, walked around the table, and stopped in front of me. I remained seated, looking her directly in the eye. I saw the madness there, the madness of a cornered animal. You think you've won? She laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. You think we're just going to walk away? Dream on. That is the Thompson family fortune. I don't care what some piece of paper says. Morally, it belongs to us. We are Samuel Thompson's blood, and you are nothing. Linda, seeing Brenda and Scott fighting back, seemed to draw strength from them. She wiped her tears, her voice now a petulant sob. That's right. We're his children. He would never treat us this way. You must have forced him. Only Kevin remained seated, his head in his hands, lost in his own world. He took no part in this frantic chorus of accusations. Perhaps, deep down, he knew it was all a lie. He knew, because he had been there to witness it all. Mr. Adler stood, his voice now steel, devoid of any sentiment. That is enough. I will not sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. Every document has been notarized. Every signature has been authenticated. Mr. Thompson's letter has also been verified. If you wish to sue, you are welcome to try. But I will warn you, you will only waste your money and further embarrass yourselves. He looked at his watch. This meeting is over. I must ask you to leave my office. But they weren't going to give up that easily. Greed is an addiction, and their withdrawal was just beginning. We're not going anywhere, Brenda declared, crossing her arms. Not until we have a reasonable settlement. She can keep a portion. A nice reward for her services. But the majority belongs to Samuel's children. I looked at Brenda. For the first time all day, I felt a twinge of pity for her. She truly didn't understand. She still thought this was a negotiation, a business deal where she could haggle for terms. I stood up. My silence was over. There will be no settlement, Brenda, I said, my voice calm but as cold as ice. There is nothing to negotiate. What is mine is mine. What your father left for you, you have already received. I turned my gaze on Kevin, Scott, and Linda. I had hoped your father's letter would make you understand. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the greed has taken such a deep root that there is no room left for the truth. My composure only seemed to infuriate them more. Scott lunged toward me, but one of Mr. Adler's young associates quickly stepped between us. Calm down, Mr. Thompson. You have no right to talk to us like that, Scott snarled, his face inches from mine. You're just an outsider. An outsider? I repeated, a sad smile touching my lips. I was there when you had a high fever. I was there at your graduations. I was there when your father was heartbroken over his mistakes. I was there for 35 years. If I'm an outsider, then I don't know how you define the word family. My words seemed to strike a nerve in Kevin. He lifted his head, his eyes red. Mom, he began, his voice hoarse. But Brenda cut him off. Don't you dare call her that. She doesn't deserve it. She turned back to me. Fine. If you want to play this game, we'll play it to the end. We are not leaving that house. It's our home. Just try and make us leave. It was a challenge. A final act of defiance. Mr. Adler stepped forward and placed another file on the table. I anticipated this, he said. This is a court order requiring you to vacate the premises at 18 Louisburg Square within 48 hours. The house is the private property of Mrs. Thompson. Your continued presence there without the owner's permission is considered illegal trespassing. If you have not left after 48 hours, the police will be called to enforce the order. The final blow. They hadn't just lost their inheritance, they were about to be legally evicted. Brenda's threat had become a pathetic joke. The reality finally sank in. There was no way out, nothing left to cling to. The play was truly over. Brenda looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a potent mix of hatred and defeat. You'll regret this, she hissed, then turned and strode out of the room without a backward glance. Scott muttered a curse and followed her. Linda, sobbing uncontrollably, scurried after them. Only Kevin remained. He sat there, motionless. He looked at me, a complex expression of shame, regret, and something akin to a plea. Mom, he stammered. I looked at him, the stepson I had once loved. Go, Kevin, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Go be with your family. There is nothing left for you here. He lowered his head, then slowly stood and staggered out of the room like a man in a trance. The door closed. The vast conference room suddenly felt empty and quiet. The battle was over. I felt no joy of victory, only an infinite weariness. and a profound sadness for a family that had destroyed itself with greed. I sat back down, feeling as if all my strength had been drained away. Mr. Adler placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Rosemary. You did it." I nodded. "Yes, Adler, we did. We fulfilled his wishes." But I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the end of a chapter. The bitterest lessons were still to come, when they had to face a life without the protection of the Thompson name, without the financial cushion they had always taken for granted. 48 hours after the reading of the will, a moving truck was parked in front of the Beacon Hill mansion. It wasn't a professional moving company, just a shabby rental truck. Under a gray Boston sky, Kevin, Scott, and Linda quietly carried cardboard boxes to the vehicle. Brenda was not there. She had left immediately after returning from the law office, leaving only a short note for Kevin. "I didn't marry a failure." The marriage built on a foundation of money had crumbled the moment that foundation disappeared. I wasn't there. I had hired a security firm to monitor the move from a distance. I didn't want to witness their humiliation. That wasn't my victory, but Mr. Adler told me about it later. He said they looked like ghosts, moving mechanically through the house that had once been theirs. There were no arguments, no tears, only the heavy silence of defeat. Their new life began with a brutal shock. $80,000, a fortune to an ordinary person, was a drop in the ocean for people used to spending millions. Instead of using it wisely to start over, they used it in a last, desperate attempt to cling to their old lifestyle. Scott, with the blind confidence of someone who always thought he was the smartest person in the room, poured all his money into a high-risk cryptocurrency scheme a friend had recommended. He dreamed of turning $80,000 into $8 million in a matter of months, of coming back and proving to the world that he had been right all along. Within 6 weeks, the entire sum vanished when the market crashed. He lost everything. Linda used her money to heal her wounded pride in the only way she knew how: shopping. She flew to Paris, checked into a luxury hotel, and threw money around the high-fashion boutiques on the Champs-Élysées. She tried to fill the emptiness in her soul with expensive handbags and shoes, but the satisfaction was fleeting. When her bank account ran dry, she was faced with an even worse reality. Not only was she broke, she was now deeply in credit card debt. Kevin was different. He didn't squander the money. He was paralyzed by fear and shame. He rented a small apartment in the suburbs, and the inheritance sat untouched in the bank. He spent his days sitting in the dark apartment, looking at old photographs, drowning in regret and self-loathing. He had lost his father, his wife, his family, and his identity. He was no longer Kevin Thompson, heir to an empire. He was nobody. 3 months later, desperation reached its peak. Scott was evicted from his apartment for unpaid rent. Linda was being chased by collection agencies. They had no other choice. Their pride had been beaten down by poverty. They decided to perform one last play. One afternoon, as I was in my new home, a modern penthouse in the Seaport district, with a view of the harbor, the doorbell rang. I looked at the security monitor and saw 3 familiar figures: Kevin, Scott, and Linda. They looked pathetic. Scott was thin and unshaven. Linda wore an old coat, and no amount of makeup could hide the dark circles under her eyes. Kevin looked like he had aged 20 years. A part of me wanted to ignore them, but another part, the part of the stepmother who had once cared for them, wouldn't let me. I took a deep breath and opened the door. They stepped inside, gawking at my new living space. It was vast and filled with light, with contemporary art on the walls. It was the complete opposite of the heavy, classical feel of the Beacon Hill house. This was the world of Rosemary Sterling, a world they had never known. "Mom," Kevin began, and this time the words sounded bitter. We came here to apologize." He launched into a well-rehearsed speech about how wrong they had been, how they had been blinded by greed. Scott and Linda nodded along, trying to look remorseful. I listened in silence, not interrupting. I let them finish their performance. They talked about how much they missed their father, how they regretted not appreciating me. They told me about the hardships they were facing. When Kevin finished, he looked at me with pleading eyes. "We know we don't deserve it, but we have nowhere else to go. Please, help us, even just a loan. We'll start over." I looked into each of their eyes. I saw no real remorse. I saw only desperation. This wasn't an apology, It was a transaction. They were trying to trade fake repentance for a financial bailout. And that's when I knew their lesson was not yet over. "Are you truly sorry?" I asked, my voice soft but sharp. "Or are you just sorry you lost?" Silence. They had no answer. "You're not sorry you called me an old leech," I continued. "You're just sorry that the leech held the purse strings. You're not sorry you broke your father's heart. You're just sorry he didn't leave you the fortune you expected." I stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the harbor. "I gave you 35 years of my life. I gave you love, care, and a life millions of people dream of. I have given more than enough." I turned back to face them. "Now it's time for you to give yourselves something. It's called dignity." The desperation on their faces curdled into anger as they realized their act had failed. "So you're not going to help?" Scott snarled. "You're just going to let us starve in the street after everything Dad did for you?" "Your father didn't do anything for me, Scott," I replied coldly. "We were partners. We built everything together, and I held up my end of the bargain. Now it's time for you to build your own lives." Chaos erupted. Scott started swearing. Linda began to wail, accusing me of being a wicked stepmother. They started blaming each other. Scott and Linda blamed Brenda, who wasn't there, for leading them astray. And then Brenda, who had been missing, suddenly appeared from behind them. She had followed them. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes were still burning. "Don't you dare blame me!" she screamed. "If you weren't so greedy, you wouldn't have listened. You're no better than I am. So don't you stand there acting so high and mighty." The argument descended into a messy squabble, accusations flying like poisoned darts. They were tearing each other apart right in my home. I couldn't listen anymore. "Stop!" I shouted, and my voice, full of power and exhaustion, silenced them all. "I am done watching this play," I said, my voice lower now but just as firm. Everything that needed to be said was said at the lawyer's office. Your lives are your own to live. Now, I want all of you to leave. If you don't, I will call the police. The final threat. They were stunned. The woman who had always been quiet, always accommodating, the woman they thought they could manipulate with a few crocodile tears, was gone. In her place stood a queen in her own castle, and she would not tolerate any more chaos. They looked at me, then at each other. The play was well and truly over. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to perform. They left quietly, without a word of goodbye. Brenda shot me one last look of pure hatred before the door closed. I stood alone in the vast apartment. The silence returned, but this time it didn't feel peaceful. It left a bitter aftertaste. I had done the right thing. I knew that. Giving them more money now would be like giving a bottle of whiskey to an alcoholic. It wouldn't save them. It would only prolong their suffering. They needed to hit rock bottom to find their own way up. But knowing I was right didn't make the pain go away. After all, for better or for worse, they had once been my family. And that was when their true ending began. Brenda and Kevin officially divorced. With no assets to fight over, the proceedings were quick. Brenda, her looks fading, and with not a penny to her name, had to move back in with her parents in a small town. Scott, after a period of homelessness, finally had to humble himself. He found a job as a laborer on a construction site. For the first time in his life, he had to sweat for his money. The calluses on his hands and the ache in his back every night were a more potent lesson than any words of advice. Linda, after selling the last of her designer bags to pay off her debts, found a job as a sales clerk in a department store. She had to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day, smiling at difficult customers. She began to understand the value of $1 and the importance of kindness. As for Kevin, he vanished. No one knew where he went. He cut off all contact with everyone. The fall was complete. Each had gone their separate way, on a path paved by their own choices. And I could only watch from afar, with a heavy heart, hoping that from these ashes, they would one day find the strength to be reborn. A year passed. A year of silence and of change. For me, it was a year of rebirth. I traveled, alone, to places I had always wanted to see, but never had the time. The ancient villages of Italy, the wild coasts of Greece. I returned to my passion for architecture, not to build skyscrapers, but to work on community projects, designing small libraries and parks for underprivileged neighborhoods. I transformed Thompson and Associates into a charitable foundation named the Samuel and Rosemary Legacy Fund, sponsoring talented but disadvantaged female architecture students. I had found a new purpose, a peace that money could never buy. I didn't think about them much anymore. The pain had faded, leaving only a quiet acceptance. Occasionally, I would hear updates from Mr. Adler. Scott was still working hard and had been promoted to foreman. Linda had gone back to school to study social work. She said she wanted to help people. Of Kevin, there was still no news. And then, Christmas Eve arrived. The city of Boston was dressed in a splendid coat of lights and fresh snow. My penthouse apartment was cozy and filled with festive cheer. I had decorated a large Christmas tree, not for anyone else, but for myself. I was sitting by the fire, reading a good book with a glass of red wine, listening to classic jazz. I felt content. Alone, but not lonely. Around 7 in the evening, the doorbell rang. I was a little surprised. I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the security monitor, and my heart gave a little squeeze. Outside the door stood Kevin, Scott, and Linda. They looked different, not glamorous or pathetic like the last time I saw them. They wore simple, clean winter clothes. Scott looked tougher and more mature, with a few new lines around his eyes. Linda wore no heavy makeup, and with her hair pulled back, she looked gentle and serene. And Kevin, he was clean-shaven, his hair cut short. He was thinner, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. They were empty-handed, except for a small, clumsily wrapped box of cookies held by Linda. I hesitated for a long moment. A part of me was still wary, but then I saw the nervousness and hope in their eyes, a sincerity I had never seen before. I opened the door. An awkward silence filled the air. "Hi, Mom," Kevin said first, his voice trembling slightly. The word Mom wasn't a tool this time, it was a plea. "Hello, children," I replied, my own voice a little unsteady. "Come in, it's cold out there." They entered timidly, like strangers. They looked around the apartment, but this time, not with envy, but with quiet admiration. We didn't come to ask for anything," Scott said, his voice deeper and steadier than before. "We just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas." Linda held out the box of cookies to me. I made these," she said, blushing slightly. "It's Grandma's recipe. Do you remember?" I took the box. Of course I remembered. I had taught her how to make those ginger snaps when she was just a little girl. A small memory, but it felt like a bridge between the past and the present. "Thank you, Linda," I said, and this time my smile was real. "They look wonderful." We sat on the sofas in the living room. No one knew what to say next. The silence stretched on, but it was no longer a silence of hostility, but one of awkwardness and things left unsaid. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat. "Mom, over the past year, we've done a lot of thinking. About everything." He looked at me, and I saw a profound regret in his eyes. Dad's letter, and everything that happened. It was like a bucket of ice water in the face. We've lived our whole lives like spoiled children. "We took everything for granted," Scott added. "Your care, Dad's sacrifices, we couldn't see it. All we saw was the money." "We're sorry," Linda whispered, her eyes welling up again. "Not for the money or the house. We're sorry for being such terrible children." And those were the words I had been waiting to hear. Not to satisfy my own pride, but to know that they had truly changed. Their remorse was no longer an act. It was real. It had been paid for with a year of hard labor, sleepless nights, and lonely tears. I took a deep breath. "I accept your apology," I said softly. "And I want to apologize too. I've already apologized to your father, but I owe you one as well. Perhaps your father and I loved you the wrong way. We gave you too many things and forgot to teach you how to stand on your own." Tears streamed down Kevin's face. "It wasn't your fault. It was ours." "It was all of ours," I said. "But the past is the past. What matters is what we learn from it and how we live from this day forward." I stood up. "Have you eaten dinner?" They looked at me surprised and shook their heads. "Then stay and have dinner with me," I said. "I've roasted a turkey. I can't possibly eat it all by myself." A radiant smile, the first real smile I'd seen in over a year, lit up Linda's face. "Really? Really?" I said. "But on one condition. Scott, you can help me get the plates in the kitchen. Linda, you can make the gravy. You still remember the recipe, don't you? Kevin, you can open that bottle of wine over there." And just like that, the awkwardness melted away. We prepared the meal together, just as we had on Christmases long ago. The sounds of chopping, of laughter, of glasses clinking. The large apartment suddenly felt warm and full of life. During dinner, they told me about their lives. Scott talked about his job, about the respect he'd earned from his coworkers. Linda talked about her classes, about the joy she found in helping someone in need. And Kevin told me he had gone away, working on a farm in Vermont for the past year. He had learned to work with his hands and found peace in a simpler life. They didn't mention money once. They talked about small achievements, about life lessons, about their hopes for the future. Later that night, when they were leaving, they hugged me, long and warm hugs. "Thank you, Mom," they said, "for everything." I stood at the door and watched their figures fade into the snowy night. I knew this wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would still be challenges ahead. The scars remained, but it was a beginning. A new beginning, built on a foundation of truth, repentance, and forgiveness. At 72, I have learned a valuable lesson about parenthood. Samuel and I, we thought that giving our children a life of material comfort was the best way to show our love, but we were wrong. We gave them the fish, but we never taught them how to fish. We protected them from the small waves, and so they couldn't stand when the storm of life finally hit. That storm, ironically, was the very thing that healed our family. I'm not proud of the pain they had to endure, but I know it was necessary for them to truly grow up. My life is peaceful now. Our foundation is helping many young women architects, and my family is slowly healing. We see each other more often. Our relationship is no longer based on dependency or obligation, but on genuine respect and love. Sometimes, Kevin, Scott, and Linda still talk about their father, but they no longer speak of him as a money-making machine, but as a flawed father who loved them deeply. They have learned to forgive him, and more importantly, to forgive themselves. And that, my friends, is the most precious legacy of all, not the $50 million, not the buildings or the company. The true legacy is when your children, after all their stumbles, learn to stand up, live a life of dignity, and appreciate the value of love. That is a legacy that cannot be written in a will. It must be written in a life.